40 years had passed since humanity first stepped onto the galactic stage, and in all that time, they had never fired a single weapon in anger against another species, the Galactic Concord, a collection of over 200 spacefaring civilizations, had watched the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. When they first arrived here was a species that had split the atom and nearly destroyed itself, yet chose to put down its weapons and reach for the stars with open hands. Instead of clenched fists, Ambassador Elena Vasquez remembered the early days well, when humanity was just a small voice in a very large room, trying to prove that they belonged among the elder races of the galaxy. She had been a young diplomat then, full of hope and idealism, believing that if humanity showed kindness and patience, the galaxy would eventually accept them as equals. Now she was 62 years old, her dark hair streaked with gray, and she had spent her entire career building bridges between Earth and the alien powers that ruled the stars. The other species found humans strange in ways they could not quite explain. The Velthari, a race of tall and elegant beings with skin like polished copper and eyes that burned like small suns, ruled 3 star clusters with an iron grip and saw all other species as either useful tools or annoying obstacles. They looked at humans and saw clever workers who could fix machines and heal the sick, but who posed no real threat to anyone. The Kreth, massive insectoid creatures who communicated through chemical signals and clicking sounds, found humans fascinating because they were so fragile yet so stubborn, refusing to give up even when logic said they should. The Morvani, ancient beings of living crystal who had watched empires rise and fall for 1,000,000 years, simply observed and said nothing. As was their way, what none of them understood was that humanity had made a choice long before they discovered faster-than-light travel. Humans had faced a simple question: would they destroy themselves, or would they find a way to live together in peace? The answer had not come easily, and the scars of that struggle still marked Earth in ways that only humans could see. But they had chosen peace, not because they were weak, but because they had looked into the abyss of total war and decided they did not want to fall in when humanity joined the Galactic Concord. They brought this hard-won wisdom with them. Earth's United Council made a decision that many of the elder races found laughable. They would maintain only a small defense fleet, just enough to protect their trade routes and colony worlds from pirates and natural disasters. Instead of building warships, they built hospital ships that traveled from world to world, offering medical care to any species that needed it. Instead of training soldiers, they trained engineers and scientists who helped develop new technologies for farming and clean energy. Instead of conquering territory, they established trade partnerships and cultural exchanges. The colony world of New Geneva was the crown jewel of humanity's peaceful expansion, located in a neutral zone between several major powers. It had been built as a place where all species could come together in cooperation and friendship. 30,000 humans lived there alongside merchants and refugees from a dozen different worlds. The streets were filled with the sounds of different languages and the smells of exotic foods from across the galaxy. Children of all species played together in parks designed to accommodate beings of every size and shape. Commander Alexander Petrov had been stationed on the orbital platform above New Geneva for 3 years, and he loved everything about the place. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a thick beard that had gone gray at the edges, and he had served in Earth's small fleet for most of his adult life. His job was not exciting, mostly consisting of inspecting cargo ships and helping lost travelers find their way. But he found satisfaction in knowing that he was protecting something good. His garrison consisted of 3 small patrol ships and about 200 personnel. Enough to handle minor emergencies, but certainly not enough to fight a real battle. That was fine with him because there was no one to fight. The Velthari Dominion's territory began just a few light years away. But they had always ignored New Geneva as beneath there. Notice, the other powers had no reason to threaten a world that existed only to help others. Sometimes, Petrov would stand at the observation deck and watch the ships coming and going, carrying goods and passengers between the stars. And he would think about how lucky he was to live in such peaceful times. Ambassador Vasquez visited New Geneva once a year, and her visits were always cause for celebration. She would walk through the markets and talk to the people, both human and alien, asking about their lives and their hopes for the future. She believed with all her heart that New Geneva represented everything humanity could achieve if they stayed true to their values. On her last visit, she had given a speech in the Central Plaza that was broadcast across the entire colony. She spoke about how humanity had once been divided by borders and beliefs, how they had fought wars over land and resources and ideas, and how they had finally learned that cooperation was better than conflict. She spoke about how the same lesson applied to the galaxy, how all species could benefit from working together instead of against each other. The crowd had cheered, and Vasquez had felt tears in her eyes because she truly believed every word she said. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that far away in the Velthari capital, a decision had been made. A human trading company had been accused of violating some minor tariff regulation, and the Dominion had decided to make an example of them. But the Velthari did not believe in trials or fines or diplomatic negotiations. They believed in power, and they believed in showing the galaxy what happened to those who displeased them. The Crimson Tide, a fleet of 12 massive dreadnoughts and 40 support vessels, had already received their orders. They were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to teach humanity a lesson that the soft and gentle humans would never forget. And on New Geneva, 30,000 innocent people went about their daily lives, completely unaware that their world had only days left to exist. The children played in the parks, the merchants sold their goods, and Commander Petrov stood at his observation deck watching the stars, never imagining that those same stars would soon be filled with fire and death. The morning on New Geneva began like any other, with the twin suns rising over the mountains and casting golden light across the sprawling city below. Commander Petrov was drinking his coffee on the observation deck when the first alarm sounded, a sharp wailing that he had never heard outside of training exercises. He dropped his cup and ran to the command center, his heart pounding in his chest as he pushed through doors and shouted for someone to tell him what was happening. The sensor officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Chun, looked up at him with a face that had gone completely white. She pointed at the screen without saying a word, and Petrov felt his blood turn to ice. 12 Velthari dreadnoughts had just appeared at the edge of the system, their massive shapes blocking out the stars like a wall of death. Behind them came 40 smaller ships, and all of them were moving toward New Geneva at attack speed. Petrov grabbed the communication console and opened a channel to the lead ship, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. He identified himself and asked for an explanation, reminding the Velthari commander that New Geneva was a neutral world under the protection of the Galactic Concord. The response came in the form of a single word: silence. Then the first plasma bolts began to rain down on the planet below. Petrov watched in horror as the city he had sworn to protect began to burn, the beautiful buildings collapsing into rubble as fire fell from the sky like rain. He screamed into the communication console, begging the Velthari to stop, telling them that there were children down there, innocent people who had done nothing wrong. His only answer was more fire. He turned to his crew and gave the order that he knew would kill them all. They would launch their 3 patrol ships and try to buy time for the evacuation shuttles to escape. Every person in that room knew they were going to die, but not a single one hesitated. They ran to their stations and prepared for a battle. They could not win. The patrol ships launched within minutes, their small forms racing toward the massive dreadnoughts like insects attacking eagles. Petrov stayed on the station to coordinate the evacuation, watching his people fly to their deaths with tears streaming down his face. The first ship lasted 4 minutes before a plasma bolt turned it into scattered debris. The second managed to get close enough to fire its weapons, but its missiles bounced harmlessly off the dreadnought's shields before the ship was torn apart. The third, commanded by a young captain named Marcus Webb, who had just become a father 6 months ago, flew directly at the lead dreadnought in a desperate ramming attempt. It was vaporized before it got within 100 kilometers down on the planet. The massacre continued for 6 terrible hours. The Valkyrie were thorough and methodical, destroying one district at a time while their soldiers landed to hunt down survivors. They did not discriminate between human and alien, between adult and child, between combatant and civilian. Everyone was a target. And the streets ran red with blood. Maria Santos was a teacher at the New Geneva Primary School, and she had gathered her students in the basement when the attack began. She held them close and sang songs to drown out the sounds of explosions above, promising them that everything would be okay. Even though she knew it was a lie when the Valkyrie soldiers found them, she stood in front of the children with her arms spread wide, begging for mercy in every language she knew. The soldier looked at her with those burning eyes and raised his weapon without a word. The last thing Maria Santos saw was the flash of plasma fire, and the last thing she heard was the screams of the children she had tried so hard to protect. By the time the Valkyrie withdrew, New Geneva was nothing but glass and ash. 28,000 humans and several hundred aliens lay dead in the ruins of what had been a shining example of peaceful cooperation. The Valkyrie had deliberately left 2,000 survivors alive, choosing people at random and herding them into a protected zone while the rest of the colony burned. These witnesses were meant to carry a message back to Earth, a message about what happened to species that forgot their place in the galaxy. Commander Petrov was among the survivors. Though he wished with all his heart that he had died with his crew, he walked through the ruins in a daze, stepping over bodies and breathing in the smell of smoke and death, unable to comprehend what had happened to the world he loved. When the rescue ships finally arrived from Earth 3 days later, Petrov was still wandering the ruins, his uniform torn and bloody, his eyes empty of everything except grief. Ambassador Vasquez was on the first ship to land, and she had to be physically restrained from running into the still burning wreckage. She screamed and cried and demanded answers that no one could give her. How could this happen? She asked over and over again. How could the galaxy let this happen? The Galactic Concord held an emergency session to address the massacre, and representatives from every major power attended. The Valkyrie ambassador, a tall and elegant creature named Lord Catherine, stood before the assembly with a smile on his copper-skinned face. He explained calmly that the attack was a legal response to trade violations, that the humans of New Geneva had broken Dominion law and faced appropriate consequences. When asked about the children and the civilians and the innocent people who had done nothing wrong, Lord Catherine simply shrugged. They were humans, he said, and humans needed to learn their place. The Concord issued a statement expressing deep concern about the loss of life, but they took no action against the Valkyrie Dominion. No sanctions were imposed, no demands were made, no justice was offered to the dead. The elder races had decided that humanity was not worth the trouble of defending, that keeping peace with the powerful Valkyrie was more important than punishing a massacre of soft and gentle beings who posed no threat to anyone. Ambassador Vasquez sat in that chamber and listened to the verdict, and something inside her broke forever. She had spent her entire life believing in diplomacy, believing that kindness and patience would eventually win, believing that the galaxy would accept humanity if they just proved themselves worthy. Now she knew the truth. The galaxy did not care about humanity at all that night. She sent her resignation to Earth, along with a handwritten note that contained only 4 words. I was wrong. 3 days later, Every major power in the galaxy received an emergency transmission from Earth. Broadcast on every frequency, in every language, the message was simple and short. And it made the elder races pause for the first time in their long lives. The message said, "No more playing nice." No one knew exactly what it meant. But something in the tone made even the Velthari feel a chill run down their spines for the first time in 40 years. The galaxy began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake in underestimating the soft and gentle humans, but it was already far too late to take it back. The Velthari border station called Ascendant Glory was the first to see them coming, and for a moment, the officers on duty thought their sensors must be malfunctioning. The readings showed something that looked like an asteroid field moving at impossible speed. A massive object so dense that it blotted out the stars behind it. Then the objects resolved into individual shapes. And the Velthari realized with growing horror what they were seeing. 300 human warships emerged from the darkness of space. Their hulls painted black as the void itself. Their weapons already glowing with power. At the head of the armada flew the flagship, a massive dreadnought called the UES Remembrance. Its hull covered with the names of every man, woman, and child who had died on New Geneva. The names were written in letters of burning gold, visible even from 1,000 kilometers away. A memorial and a promise of vengeance combined. The commander of Ascendant Glory was a veteran named Lord Vethran, who had served the Dominion for 200 years. And he had never seen anything like this. He opened a communication channel and demanded that the human fleet identify itself and explain its presence in Velthari space. The response came from Admiral Wei Chun herself. Her face appearing on every screen in the station. She spoke only 6 words before cutting the channel. "We are here for our dead lord." Vethran ordered his station to fire a warning shot across the bow of the lead ship. A standard intimidation tactic that had worked on every species the Dominion had ever encountered. The humans did not slow down, did not change course, did not respond in any way to the shot. They simply kept coming. And Lord Vethran felt fear for the first time in his very long life. The battle for Ascendant Glory lasted exactly 17 minutes. The human ships moved with a coordination that the galaxy had never seen. Each vessel knowing exactly where to be and what to do without any apparent communication. They had spent 40 years studying the other species, learning their tactics and their weaknesses. And now they used that knowledge with devastating efficiency. The station's shields failed within the first 5 minutes. Overwhelmed by weapons that should not have existed, the defense fleet that scrambled to intercept the humans was destroyed in the next 10 minutes. Picked apart by fighters and bombers that seemed to be everywhere at once. Lord Vethran sent a final message to the Dominion capital, warning them that something terrible was coming. Before the Remembrance's main guns turned his station into expanding cloud of debris, the 3-week war had begun across Velthari space. The human fleet split into multiple task forces, each one striking at a different target with perfect timing. Supply depots that had taken decades to build were destroyed in hours. Communication relays that connected the Dominion's far-flung territories went dark one by one. Military bases that had never been threatened found themselves under attack by enemies who seemed to know every secret, every weakness, every blind spot in their defenses. The Velthari admirals tried to coordinate a response, but their orders were intercepted and their plans anticipated before they could be executed. Humanity had spent 40 years pretending to be harmless while quietly learning everything there was to know about their potential enemies. They knew the codes, the protocols, the chain of command, the personal habits of every important officer. It was not a war so much as a systematic dismantling of everything the Dominion had built. Commander Petrov led the assault on a fortress world called Krathvorn, a heavily defended planet that the Velthari considered impossible to conquer. He had requested the assignment personally. Knowing that the garrison commander was the same officer who had led the ground forces at New Geneva, the battle for Krathvorn became legendary among human soldiers. A story they would tell for generations. Petrov's Marines landed under heavy fire. Their dropships screaming through a sky filled with anti-aircraft plasma, they hit the ground running and did not stop. Pushing through defenses that should have held them for weeks, the Valkyrie soldiers were bigger and stronger, bred for combat over thousands of years. But they had never faced an enemy like this. Human soldiers kept fighting with wounds that should have killed them. Using pain as fuel instead of letting it slow them down, they worked in teams that moved like single organisms, covering each other and exploiting every opening with ruthless efficiency. They did not fight for glory or honor or territory. They fought with the cold fury of people who had nothing left to lose. When Petrov finally cornered the garrison commander in his bunker, the Valkyrie officer tried to surrender. He said that he was just following orders, that the attack on New Geneva was not his idea, that he did not deserve to die for the decisions of his superiors. Petrov looked at him with eyes that held no mercy and no pity. He told the Valkyrie that 28,000 people had not deserved to die either. And then he pulled the trigger on the 16th day of the war. Human Marines boarded the Valkyrie flagship, the Crimson Vengeance, the same class of vessel that had led the attack on New Geneva. The elite guard that protected the ship were the finest warriors the Dominion had ever produced. 7 feet tall and trained from birth to kill, they expected the humans to be easy prey. Soft creatures who would break at the first sign of real resistance. They were wrong. The fighting in the corridors of the Crimson Vengeance lasted for 12 hours. A nightmare of close combat and brutal violence that neither side would ever forget. Human soldiers used their own bodies as shields, throwing themselves on grenades to protect their squad mate. They kept fighting with broken bones and missing limbs, refusing to fall until they had taken at least one more enemy with them. The elite guard found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, an enemy that simply would not stop. By the time the last Valkyrie defender fell, the human boarding party had lost 60% of its strength. But they had captured the ship. The Dominion High Command watched a live feed of their flagship being taken and felt something they had not experienced in 1,000 years. Despair. On the 21st day, the Valkyrie Dominion surrendered unconditionally. Lord Catherine, the same ambassador who had smiled while explaining the massacre at New Geneva, was brought before Admiral Chun in chains. She looked at him with contempt and told him the terms of Earth's victory. Every official who had ordered or participated in the attack on New Geneva would face human justice. Reparations would be paid to the survivors and the families of the dead. The Dominion would broadcast a message to the entire galaxy, in their own voices, admitting that they had been wrong about humanity. Lord Catherine tried to negotiate, tried to bargain, tried to threaten, but Chun simply turned and walked away. There was nothing left to discuss. The message was broadcast 3 days later, and every species in the galaxy heard Lord Catherine's voice speaking words he had never imagined he would say. "We were wrong about humanity," he said, and his voice trembled with shame and fear. "They are not soft," he said. "They are not weak. They are not prey. We made a terrible mistake, and we have paid the price." The broadcast ended, but its echo would reverberate through the galaxy for centuries to come. In the weeks following the massacre, something strange began to happen across the galaxy that no one could explain. Human trade ships stopped arriving at alien ports, their regular schedules abandoned without warning or apology. Human doctors walked out of the hospitals they had built on foreign worlds, leaving their patients in the care of confused local staff who did not understand why their human colleagues were leaving. Human engineers packed up their tools and departed from joint research projects, erasing their data and taking their knowledge with them. Human diplomats closed their offices and returned to Earth, speaking to no one and explaining nothing at first. The other species were confused but not worried. They assumed the humans were grieving, that this withdrawal was a temporary response to the tragedy at New Geneva. The Valkyrie found the whole situation amusing, joking among themselves that the soft little humans had finally learned their lesson. Lord Catherine told his peers that Earth would come crawling back within a month, begging for the chance to resume trade and cooperation. He was wrong. 1 month became 2, and then 3, and still the humans did not return. Earth went completely silent, responding to no communications and accepting no visitor ships that approached Earth's solar system were turned away by automated defense platforms that had never been active before. The Concorde sent diplomatic missions to ask what was happening, but their messages went unanswered. By the 6th month, the galaxy was no longer confused. It was starting to become nervous. The Morvani, those ancient beings of living crystal who had watched civilizations rise and fall for 1,000,000 years, made a rare public statement. They said that they had seen this pattern before, long ago, when a young and angry species went quiet before erupting into violence that shook the stars. The bee. Other races dismissed the warning as the rambling of ancient fossils who had forgotten how the modern galaxy worked. Humanity was soft. They said humanity was weak. Humanity had no army and no weapons and no way to threaten anyone. What they did not know, what no one in the galaxy knew, was what was happening beneath the frozen surface of Europa. One of the moons of Jupiter, Admiral Wei Chun, stood in the control center of the largest shipyard humanity had ever built, watching as massive vessels took shape in the construction bays around Hirsch. He was 73 years old, her hair completely white and her face lined with age. But her eyes were sharp and cold as the ice above her head. She had commanded Earth's last true warship 30 years ago, back before humanity decided to embrace peace and put away their weapons. Now she had been called out of retirement to lead something that the optimistic leaders of Earth had hoped would never be needed. The Europa shipyards had been built in secret during the early years of first contact, when some humans had worried that the galaxy might not be as friendly as it seemed. Peaceful faction had won the political debate, and the shipyards had been mothballed but never dismantled. The construction equipment sat dormant beneath the ice, waiting for a day that the optimists prayed would never come. That day had come. 300 warships were taking shape in those hidden bays. Vessels designed by engineers who had studied every species in the galaxy and built machines to destroy them all. These were not the small patrol ships that had died defending New Geneva. These were monsters of metal and fire, armed with weapons that the galaxy had never seen in the Australian outback on Earth. Research facilities that had been sealed for decades reopened their doors. Scientists who had been working on medicine and farming suddenly found themselves reassigned to weapons development, digging out old plans and creating new terrors in bunkers beneath the mountains of Switzerland. Generals who had spent their careers teaching history at military academies now planned real campaigns against real enemies across every continent and every colony. Humanity prepared for war. Admiral Chun walked among her crews, looking at the faces of the men and women who would soon fly these ships into battle. They came from every nation and every background, united by grief and rage and a burning desire for justice. Many of them had lost family on New Geneva. All of them had lost their innocence. She stopped to speak with a young pilot named James Okonkwo, whose sister had been a teacher at the New Geneva primary school. His eyes were hard and his jaw was set. And when he spoke about the coming battle, his voice did not shake. He told the admiral that he was not afraid to die, that he would gladly give his life to make the Valkyrie pay for what they had done. Chun looked at him for a long moment, then put her hand on his shoulder. She told him that she did not want him to die for Earth. She wanted him to make the enemy die for the Dominion. The young pilot smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile throughout those 6 months of silence. Commander Petrov worked in the shipyards as well, helping to train the crews who would man the new fleet. He had not smiled since New Geneva, and he rarely spoke except to give orders or answer questions. The other officers whispered that he was a broken man, that the massacre had destroyed something essential inside him. They were wrong. Petrov was not broken. He was focused, channeling all of his grief and guilt into the single task of preparing humanity for revenge. He dreamed of burning Valkyrie ships every night, and he woke each morning ready to make those dreams come true. When the fleet was finally ready, Admiral Chun gathered her commanders for a final briefing. She stood before a holographic map of Valkyrie space, pointing out targets and explaining strategies that she had developed over months of careful planning. They would strike fast and hard, using tactics that the galaxy had never seen, fighting in ways that no species had ever fought before. They would not stop until justice was done. At the end of the briefing, she looked at her officers and spoke the words that would define the war to come. She told them that for 40 years, humanity had chosen to be gentle, had chosen to be kind, had chosen to help others and hurt no one. She told them that the galaxy had mistaken this choice for weakness, had thought that humans were soft prey to be exploited and abused. She told them that the galaxy was about to learn the truth. Humans did not choose peace because they could not make war. They chose peace because they knew exactly what they were capable of, and they had hoped to never show it again. That hope was dead now, burned to ash along with the children of New Geneva. It was time to remind the galaxy why humanity had once been the most terrifying species on their own planet. It was time to show them what happened when the sleeping giant finally woke up. 1 year after the 3-week war, the Galactic Concord gathered for its annual assembly in the Great Chamber on the neutral world of Nexus Prime. Representatives from every major power filled the circular hall, their different forms and colors creating a tapestry of alien life that stretched from one end of the room to the other. The mood was tense and uncertain, for everyone knew that something had changed in the galaxy, something fundamental that could never be undone. The seat reserved for humanity had been empty for over a year, but today there was a murmur of anticipation running through the crowd. Word had spread that Earth was sending a representative, though no one knew exactly what to expect. When the doors at the far end of the chamber opened, every eye turned to see who would walk through. Ambassador Elena Vasquez entered alone, her steps slow and deliberate, her face calm and unreadable. She had aged in the years since New Geneva, her hair now completely white and her skin marked with new lines. But she carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. The chamber fell completely silent as she walked toward the center of the room, passing the rows of seats where the junior species traditionally sat. She did not stop at her old seat, the small chair in the back where humanity had been placed when they first joined the Concorde. Instead, she walked all the way to the center podium, the raised platform reserved for the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. No one tried to stop her, though several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Valkyrie representative, a nervous young lord who had replaced the disgraced Catherine, kept his eyes fixed on the floor and refused to meet her gaze. Vasquez stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled species, taking her time to meet the eyes of as many delegates as she could. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the vast chamber. She began by telling them a story they already knew, the story of how humanity had joined the Concorde 40 years ago. She reminded them of the hospitals Earth had built, the diseases they had cured, the technologies they had shared freely with anyone who asked. She spoke of New Geneva and the dream it represented, a dream of cooperation and friendship between species who had once been strangers. She spoke of how that dream had been burned to ash along with 28,000 innocent lives. The chamber remained silent, not a single delegate daring to interrupt. Vasquez paused and let the weight of her words settle over the assembly before continuing. She told them that she had resigned after the massacre because she had lost faith, because she had believed that kindness and patience would eventually win. And the galaxy had proven her wrong. She told them that she had spent the past year searching for a new understanding, a way to reconcile what humanity had always believed with what the galaxy had shown them. She said that she had finally found her answer, and she wanted to share it with them. For 40 years, humanity had chosen to be gentle, because they believed it was the right thing to do. They had helped the sick and fed the hungry, and built bridges between species because they genuinely wanted to make the galaxy a better place that had not been a lie or a deception or a trick. It had been the honest expression of humanity's highest values, but the galaxy had made a mistake in interpreting the gentleness as weakness. They had looked at humans and seen soft creatures who could be pushed around and exploited without consequence. They had watched children burn and done nothing because they believed humanity posed no threat. Vasquez's voice grew harder as she continued, her eyes sweeping across the chamber with an intensity that made several delegates look away. She told them that humanity had not chosen peace because they were incapable of war. She reminded them that before humans ever reached for the stars, they had spent thousands of years learning how to kill each other with terrible efficiency. They had invented weapons that could destroy entire cities, poisons that could wipe out populations, strategies of war that left nothing but scorched earth behind. They had looked into the abyss of total annihilation and somehow found the strength to step back from the edge when they joined the galaxy. They brought all of that knowledge with them, locked away behind a choice to be better than their history. The choice was real, Vasquez said, but it was still a choice. And choices could be changed. She told the assembly that Earth had resumed its peaceful mission since the war ended. Human doctors had returned to the hospitals they had built. Human engineers had gone back to their research projects. Human diplomats had reopened their offices across the galaxy. Earth wanted to help, wanted to build, wanted to be a positive force in the universe, just as they had always tried to be. But something had changed, and she wanted everyone to understand exactly what that change meant. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the podium, her eyes burning with quiet fire. If anyone ever threatens our people again, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber. If anyone ever looks at our kindness and sees weakness, if anyone ever thinks they can harm our children without consequence, she straightened up and spoke her final words with absolute clarity. Remember New Geneva. Remember what happened after. And remember that we showed you mercy. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of Vasquez's footsteps echoed like thunder as she turned and walked toward the exit. She did not look back, did not wait for a response, did not show any interest in what the other species might say or think. Her message had been delivered, and there was nothing left to discuss behind her. The assembly sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the truth they had missed for 40 years. The Morveni elders, those ancient beings of living crystal, nodded slowly to each other in recognition. They had seen this before, long ago, in species that had risen from violence to wisdom and back again, but they had never seen it happen so quickly, or so completely, or with such controlled precision. The Creth clacked quietly among themselves, their chemical signals carrying messages of caution and respect. They had always found humans fascinating, and now they understood why. Here was a species that could be gentle or terrible, depending on how they were treated. And the galaxy had just learned the price of treating them badly. Even the Volturi representative looked up as Vasquez left, his young face pale with the weight of what his people had done. He knew that his species would spend generations paying for the arrogance of their elders, and he wondered if the Dominion would ever truly recover in the weeks and months that followed. The galaxy adjusted to the new reality that humanity had created Earth, remained committed to its mission of peace and cooperation. But the other species treated them differently. Now human diplomats were given seats at the high tables. Human opinions were sought on important matters. Human requests were treated with careful attention. It was not quite fear that motivated this new respect. Though fear was certainly part of it, it was something closer to understanding. A recognition that humanity had always been exactly what they claimed to be. They were a species that valued kindness and compassion above all else, that genuinely wanted to help and heal and build. But they were also a species that had crawled up from the mud, through millions of years of brutal evolution, that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars, that had looked death in the face so many times that they had learned to stare back without blinking. The galaxy had finally learned the lesson that humanity had tried to teach them. Gently for 40 years, kindness was not the same as weakness. Mercy was not the same as helplessness, and a soft hand that offered healing could also clench into a fist that brought destruction. Commander Petrov returned to active duty after the war, taking command of a new orbital station above a rebuilt New Geneva. He stood on the observation deck each morning and watched the colony grow again. New buildings rising from the ashes, new families making homes where the old ones had died. He still did not smile very often. But sometimes, when he saw children playing in the parks below, he felt something like Peace Admiral Chung retired again, this time permanently. Returning to her home in Beijing to write her memoirs, she spent her remaining years teaching young officers at the military academy, making sure that humanity would never forget what they were capable of when pushed too far. And Ambassador Vasquez continued her work in the Concord, fighting for peace and cooperation and all the things she had always believed in, but now she did so from a position of strength, backed by the knowledge that her species would never again be underestimated. On the anniversary of New Geneva's destruction, she always visited the memorial that had been built on the colony world. She would stand before the wall of names and remember everyone who had been lost, and she would renew her promise to make their deaths mean something. The galaxy would remember what happened there. She knew, and the galaxy would remember what happened after. And as long as that memory endured, no one would ever make the same mistake again. Humanity had finally found their place among the stars, not as gentle helpers or fearsome conquerors, but as something far more complex. They were the species that chose kindness but knew violence, that offered peace but prepared for war, that hoped for the best but planned for the worst. They were human. And now the entire galaxy understood exactly what that meant.